Hi everybody, today's focus is going to be on the system, integumentary system. So before we get started into more of the anatomy of the system, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the essential functions. So the largest part of the integumentary system is the skin, which basically covers most of the body surfaces, and it acts as a physical barrier between the external environment and our internal environment. The main goal of having this barrier would be to provide protection, basically, which makes sense. Now, this protection could be a physical protection against trauma, or it could be protection against chemical or microorganisms that live outside or in the external environment. The second function of our integumentary system is maintaining your body temperature or thermoregulation. So if you think about when you get hot, one of the symptoms that depict itself is you getting that kind of flush tone on your skin. So the main reason for that is that you have a lot of blood vessels within your dermal layer of your skin, and when your body temperature needs to be regulated, these blood vessels dilate and allow a significant amount of heat to be radiated away from your skin. Now, the opposite is also true. So if you are in an environment where your body temperature is starting to decline because of the coldness in the external environment, then your body will protect itself or try to regulate its temperature by constricting the blood vessels that are present in your skin and basically limiting the blood flow to your skin. In such scenarios, then your skin look more pale compared to your normal skin tone because of lack of basically blood in your skin or lower circulation of blood to your skin. You also have cutaneous sensations. So in the dermal layer of your skin, you have a significant nerve connections and nerve endings. These are called either tactile or Merkel cells. These cells are essential in terms of collecting data regarding pressure, temperature, vibrations from your external environment and transferring that to give you basically your sense of touch or your somatosensory. You also have excretion of waste. So if you think about your sweat glands, though it is part of the body temperature regulation, they also remove some of the waste product and extra electrolyte and water from your system. We'll get into more details about how what is the role of your oil gland and your sweat glands in terms of your integumentary system. So as I mentioned earlier, integumentary system consists mostly of your skin. However, you do have what we identified as accessory structures, which is hair, nails, sweat glands. There are two types of sweat glands. We'll talk about those as well. And then your oil gland, also known as the sebaceous gland. So when you look at the skin has two main or distinct layers. These two layers are epidermis, which is the top or outermost layer of your skin. It is the layer that you can actually touch. This layer is identified as avascular, which basically means there is no blood vessels in that. So if you think about if you get a cut and there is no bleeding, that means the depth of that cut is within your epidermal layer. Underneath the epidermis, you have your dermis layer. This dermis layer is comparatively thicker than your epidermis. It is mostly made up of dense, irregular connective tissue. It is highly vascularized, and it also contains glands such as your sweat glands and your oil glands. It contains your hair follicles and a lot of the nerve endings that collects data for your sense of touch. Now, I have listed hypodermis here as well, but please do note that hypodermis or superficial fascia or subcutaneous layer are technically not or is not part of your skin. It is basically a layer of fat that connects your skin to the underlying tissue. It also acts as a really good insulator. So it helps basically maintain your core body temperature. So in sense of that whole insulation, kind of think about when you look at an elderly, they're typically wearing multiple layers of clothing, even though if the temperature is pretty normal, or you're running around with a t-shirt. The main reason for that is as you age, this layer of hypodermis, this fat layer underneath your skin, becomes thinner and thinner. Therefore, the insulation goes away, and you basically will not be able to maintain that core temperature. Another role that it has, it absorbs shock. So a lot of times if you have some sort of physical trauma, it can take some of that extra force that basically is placed on your skin and prevent the damage to the tissues that lie underneath it. Now here's a picture. This is a really good picture. I want you guys to be comfortable for it for both your lecture and your lab. So I want to just kind of highlight some of the essential structures you see in this picture. So first of all, we have the epidermal layer or epidermis, which is the outermost layer. You have your dermal layer, which is the much thicker layer. Should be noted that the dermal layer or dermis is made up of a smaller layer called papillary layer and a much larger layer called reticular layer. I will discuss this as we go through the PowerPoint today. Underneath, again, you have that fat layer, which is your hypodermis or your subcutaneous layer. You have your nervous structure, which is what you see in these yellow structures. They are different. There's sensory nerve, they're lamellar corpuscle, and what we identify as hair follicle receptors. Basically, if you pull the hair out and you feel that pain, that's what that sensation comes from. You can see all of these blood vessels running through the dermal layer. So the red and blue basically is identifying your arteries and veins. You have your hair follicle, and inside your hair follicle, you will have your hair root. You have attached to your hair follicle these glands that are your sebaceous or your oil gland. And then you also have an example of a sweat gland here. So you only have the eccrine gland depicted here. If the apocrine gland was shown, which is another type of sweat gland, then you will see those to be much larger than what you would see in terms of the eccrine sweat glands. That's about it as far as the structures that I want you guys to know for this picture. So again, please make sure you review this and be comfortable with identifying each of the structures. The last one, actually, before I forget, is these little muscles you see that's connected to the hair. These muscles are called erectile pili muscle. So when you get goosebumps, or when you get scared and your hair stands straight, these are basically these muscles contracting and forcing your hair to go from that kind of bent, relaxed position to the standing position. So again, these muscles are called erectile pili, and they're typically controlled by your sympathetic nervous system during a fight or flight response. Now, looking at the epidermis. So we're going to take a look at each of the layers of the skin in a little bit more detail. So starting with your epidermis, one of the main characteristics in terms of what your epidermis is made up of is that it's characterized as keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium, which basically means that you have cells that are packed with keratin. These cells are relatively flat. And the word stratified implies that there are multiple layers of these cells stacked on top of each other. Now, when we look at the epidermis, epidermis has four main types of cells. Most of the cells we have, and you literally have billions of these cells, are called keratinocytes. Now, keratinocytes receive their name because they make a protein called keratin. Now, this protein is extremely important in your skin. It has a protective property. It also extremely important in terms of preventing water loss from your skin. So basically, it helps you waterproof your skin, and it also protects it from the external environment. Keratinocytes are connected together via these protein joints that extends from one cell to another, called desmosomes. So you may remember desmosomes from your previous class. Desmosomes are basically these linker proteins that connect together and basically allow the tension to be spread evenly. Now, in reality, if you look at keratinocytes, which is again majority of the cells we have on the epidermal layer, you actually lose millions of these cells every day. This is the cells, these are keratinocytes that are being dead, and you basically, every time you wash your hand, every time you take a shower, you get rid of that top layer of the skin, which are simply dead keratinocytes. What else do we have? So another type of cells that we have are called melanocytes. So melanocytes, as the name implies, are going to be the cells that produce a pigment or a color pigment called melanin. Now, what we identify as our skin tone, most of that is associated with this protein called melanin. It is not the only contributor to our skin tone, but it is one of the most important ones. Now, melanin has a very important role in our skin. That role is that when you are being exposed to ultraviolet or UV rays, melanocytes produce a significantly higher level of melanin, and these melanins are going to travel into your keratinocytes and protect the genetic information of your keratinocytes against the UV rays. And I'll go into a little more detail later on when I talk about melanin and the skin tone for you. So keep that in mind, that melanins are actually produced by melanocytes, and their job is to protect the genetic information or DNA of your keratinocytes against UV damage. If these melanins do not do their job, you become more susceptible to cancer, or more specifically, skin cancer. Another cells category we have are called dendritic cells or Langerhans cells. These cells are extremely important in terms of providing immunity for our body. So think about them because your skin is the first barrier against chemical or microorganism that can get in from the external environment. These macrophages, these dendritic cells, are going to be extremely important for providing that initial protection or initial layer of defense against these microorganisms. Lastly, we have cells called tactile or Merkel cells. These cells are part of your somatosensory or your sensory receptors and give you the ability to create your sense of touch. Now, let's dive in further into your epidermis. So if you look at epidermal layer just by itself under the microscope, you can distinguish between 4 to 5 distinct layers under the microscope for your skin. Now, I'm saying 4 or 5 because parts of your body has thicker layers of the skin because of the direct or constant physical contact with the external environment. So that thicker skin typically associated with your hands or your feet. So the palms of your hand or the soles of your foot have thicker layers, or thicker skin, I should say, compared to the rest of your body, which has thin skin. Now, epidermal layer has 4 distinct layers when we're talking about the thin skin or a typical skin. Starting from the base of your epidermis, which is the innermost layer, the one that is next to your dermis, they are stratum basal, stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum, stratum lucidum, which is again only present in the thick skin, and the top or the outermost layer of your skin will be referred to as a stratum corneum. So let's take a look at each of these layers in a little bit more detail. So a stratum basal or basal layer, it's the innermost lining of your epidermis. This layer is extremely important in terms of creating new skin cells. How do they do that? They actually use the process called mitosis. Now that should sound really familiar to you. It's a typical procedure or cell division for all of our cells that can undergo regular cell division with the exception of your sex cells. So these are somatic cells in another sense. So basal layer or stratum basal are continuously dividing, or I should say the cells in these layers are continuously dividing through the process of mitosis to replenish the new cells as the old cells are basically removed every day. Now, right on top of that layer, we have a second layer called a stratum spinosum. This is called also prickly layer. What is the importance of this layer? This is where your cells or your keratinocytes start to create a significant amount of desmosomes. Remember those protein connections, those linkers? That's where it's taking place. Now you want to build a skin that can withstand tension. And putting on those desmosomes give you that capacity to connect those cells and create a very strong layer that basically holds your skin together under significant tension. Now, right on top of that, we have our third layer. This is called a stratum granulosum or granular layer. Basically, when you take a look at these cells, you can see these little tiny circles or structures inside these cells. What are those little granules carry? They actually carry a significant amount of keratin protein. I'm gonna remind you guys that keratin protein is there because it's going to provide protection and also waterproofing your skin. So, water resistance, because it has significant amount of glycolipid that preventing water loss. And again, at this point, you're basically done. These cells are ready to go into their role in terms of protection. So anything on top of that layer, the cells will start to actually die off or completely dead. Now, the fourth layer that I have listed, again, it's really important for you guys to remember. These are, this layer is only present in the thick skin, just typically the palm of your hand or the sole of your foot. And this is called the stratum lucidum. The word lucidum implies that this is a clear layer. Typically, it's made up of 2 or 3 layers of clear, flat, dead keratinocytes. So it provides an additional layer of protection. Now, the top or outermost layer of your epidermis is known as a stratum corneum. This is called the horny layer. This layer is really, I think it's really cool because even though it's made up of 20 to 30 rows of dead skin cells, right? These are the actual ones that are providing protection against your external environment, right? They are the ones that are preventing water loss. They are the ones that basically protect you against chemical or trauma that is from your external environment. They're the ones that prevent pathogens from getting inside of you. So again, remember that a stratum corneum, the top or the outermost skin layer, as you basically wash your hands, you take a shower, you scratch, these skin cells, these dead skin cells are continuously coming off. but they are being replaced by the bottom layers as the new cells are being produced. So kind of you produce new cells from the bottom, which pushes the old ones to the top. And by the time they get to the top or outermost layer, they are dead and you're ready to remove them. Here is a picture. So in this picture, you can see the thickness of your stratum corneum. It's significantly or relatively more than your other layers. You have right underneath them stratum granulosum, you have your stratum spinosum, and at the base, a single layer of a stratum basal. Please do note here again that this is a depiction of a thin skin, which is most of your body. It is missing a stratum lucidum, which would have normally sat between a stratum corneum and a stratum granulosum. Now, let's go ahead and start taking a look at your dermal layer. So dermal layer is mostly made up of what we identify as dense, irregular connective tissue. So it is highly vascularized. It does contain significant amount of nerves as well as lymphatic vessels, which are basically the ones that are going to collect liquid or collect leaked fluid and also provide immunity. This layer, this dermal layer, also includes your hair follicle, your sweat glands, your oil glands, and your nerve endings. Now, as I mentioned before, there are two layers within that. The papillary layer, which is the one directly beneath your epidermis, and then the reticular layer, which is a much thicker layer, is about 80% of your dermal layer. Now, there is a significantly high level of protein fibers in here. The main two types of protein fibers you will see are going to be two types, and I'm going to show you this in just a second. They are going to be collagen fiber with the goal of providing a strength for your dermal layer. And second is elastic fibers, which are essential for recoiling ability of your skin. Please understand that the word elastic does not imply that you can pull something and make it longer. When you use the word elastic, it implies that when you stretch something, as you let it go, it will return back to its original shape. So when you think about younger people, their skin is super elastic because they have no wrinkles. As you age, then the wrinkles starts to appear because your skin loses elasticity. Here's a really good depiction of the separation between the epidermis and the two layers of the dermis. You have your epidermal layer here up to this point, and then you have this kind of a lighter shade. That's your papillary layer, about 20% of your dermis. And then right underneath that, with all of the dense irregular connective tissue right below that would be the reticular layer. Now, within your papillary layer, you will have what we identify as friction ridges, better known as fingerprints. So these ridges are the most superficial ones that are connected to your papillary layer. They help us with gripping stuff. So if you didn't have that, things would have slipped a lot easier. They contribute to your sense of touch. They also have where the sweat pores and the ridges, the sweat pores located within this layer, and having these friction ridges basically are unique to individuals, and therefore you will end up with individual or unique fingerprints for each person. One quick note before I move on from the papillary layer, guys. If I ask you what type of tissue is going to be the papillary layer made up of, your answer should be areolar connective tissue. If this sounds unfamiliar to you, please go back to your previous course and study your histology slides on the areolar connective tissue. Next, we have your reticular layer. So reticular layer, as we mentioned multiple times already, is about 80% of your dermal thickness. It is important to note that there is an actual histological difference between reticular and papillary layer. So while papillary layer was mostly made up of areolar connective tissue, in terms of reticular, we're talking about dense fibrous connective tissue, more specifically irregular dense connective tissue. They contain, again, as I mentioned, significant amount of collagen for the purpose of strength, and they also contain elastic fibers for the purpose of recoiling, right? Returning back your skin to normal patterns. Now, associated with the reticular layer, we will have two types of lines. Now, one of these that are really visible is the one, if you have ever done palm reading, that's the one that they use. These are called flexure lines. This is where your dermal layers gets connected to the joints that are right underneath them. So these structures are basically create very particular lines, and they are visible in your feet, the soles of your feet, and they're visible in your toes, your fingers, as well as your wrist and the palm of your hand. So basically what you see here in this picture, what we have, these are called flexure lines. On this side, what we have is your friction ridges, which is the same thing as your fingerprint. Now we have something else as well called cleavage or tension lines. Now these tension lines are not something that would be visible like your friction or flexure lines. These are basically patterns that are observed in collagen fibers. So remember, collagen fibers are there for the strength. So they have particular patterns in different parts of the body, as you can see in this picture. So if a surgeon wants to cut and is capable, they try to go parallel to these collagen fibers. The reason being is as you go parallel, there is less damage to these collagen fibers, which means the body has an easier time healing. However, if the cut produced by a surgeon is perpendicular to these cleavage lines, then you're literally cutting through a lot of these collagen fibers, and therefore it takes longer for the body to recover from the incision. So does it mean the surgeons always go with the cleavage line? The answer is of course not, but again, as much as they can, they do try to go based on those lines. Couple of things that you may see in terms of your skin are blisters and stretch marks. So a stretch mark, simply put, is when your dermal layer is undergoing significant stretching in a very short period of time. So basically, your skin doesn't have the opportunity to grow as the stretching takes place. Typically visible in people that gain significant amount of weight in a short period of time, for instance, pregnant women. There are creams that does help with stretch marks. It helps with fixing of these damages to the dermal layer, but typically it's not 100%. Blisters is another one. Blisters are formed when your epidermal layer and your dermal layers are separated from each other as a result of some sort of trauma or repetitive motion. And that causes the fluid to be built up between these two layers and basically bubble out in the form of a blister. Again, if you do have a blister in a specific region, it's a result of separation between the two layers of the skin. Okay, so I'm gonna stop here and then we'll pick up the integumentary system part 2 in our next lecture.